Welcome to this online dialogue on faith and the faithful in the 2020 elections, on religion, racism, the coronavirus crisis. My name is John Carn. I'm director of the initiative, and I'm delighted you've joined us. Since the Georgetown shutdown, we have done 9 dialogues, several on the COVID-19, the moral and human dimensions, one with Latino leaders, one with young leaders, major dialogue on racism, dialogue with the Vatican on Pope Francis' environmental encyclical. We've had a wonderful response. In fact, a stunning response. I just checked a few minutes ago, 3,030 people have signed up for this. So there is a hunger for a discussion of the moral, the human, the religious dimensions of public life, and we think today's discussion will help advance that. We invite you to share your thoughts on social media and ask questions to the panel using the prompts at the bottom of the screen. We are roughly 5 months away from the November election, and it's worth recalling that 5 months ago, President Trump was celebrating the escape from impeachment by a vote of the U.S. Senate and planning to campaign on the basis of a growing economy, record low unemployment numbers, and the economic shape the country was in. 5 months ago tomorrow, Joe Biden finished 5th in New Hampshire, and there was a lot of discussion. He was actually being written off as out of touch and a bad fit for a Democratic Party ready for new and progressive leadership. Now, 5 months later, our nation, our faith, our politics have been tested by a global and seeming unending pandemic, which has cost 130,000 lives and untold suffering and loss. Our economy has collapsed with millions out of work, with lost jobs, wages, wealth, businesses, and no clear path forward. And appalling videos of unarmed Black men in our streets have led to unprecedented protests and a national reckoning on racism. We often call racism America's original sin, but it's also an open and festering wound that infects all our society. There's no better evidence of the persistence of racism than the fact that COVID-19 and the economic crisis, while it touches all of us, disproportionately hurts people in communities of color. All this, the election, the coronavirus, and the economic crisis, test communities and people of faith. How we respond will be a test of our hearts, our minds, our souls, and especially our consciences. That's why so many of us have come together on a Friday afternoon in July, and we have a terrific group of leaders to help us analyze and understand these challenges. We'll begin with Greg Smith from Pew, who will brief us on the trends from their recent report on religion in the 2020 campaign. Gabby Orr is a White House reporter for Politico, and her journalism at the intersection of faith and politics is getting a lot of attention. Justin Giboney is the founder of the End Campaign, which tries to bring together biblical values and political responsibility. And Janae Lewis is a leader in the initiative Salt and Light Gatherings for young leaders, and an example of someone who doesn't talk about action, but actually acts. She's running for DC City Council. And Mike Gerson, known to many of us, was a speechwriter and key advisor in the Bush White House and writes about the moral and religious dimensions of public life in the Washington Post. So let me first turn to you, Greg. As I said, you're Associate Director of Research at Pew. One of the things people may not know is you wrote a book called Politics in the Parish, The Political Influence of Catholic Priests. Pew has become the essential place for data and analysis on lots of things, but especially the connection between faith and public life. Something that's ignored by other polls and frankly misunderstood or neglected. Last week, you and your colleagues at Pew released a major report on faith and politics in this campaign. What can you share with us? What's going on? What's happening with Catholics, with evangelicals? What's happening in terms of Trump and Biden? What is happening with religious voters and religious communities? Greg.
Well, thank you, John, for those very kind words. You know, the data show pretty clearly that the public's mood has soured in a variety of ways in recent months. In fact, the headline on one of our recent reports was that the public's mood turns grim. And I've got some slides here that can help to illustrate that. Let me just pull them up. So, reflecting that general souring of the nation's mood, our latest data show that Donald Trump's approval rating has declined since April among a wide range of religious groups. You can see here that white evangelical Protestants remain the president's strongest supporters. 72% of them now say they approve of the way he is handling his job. But that number is down 6 points just since April. Among white Catholic voters, 54% now say they approve of Trump's performance in office, down 8 points since April. Fewer than a quarter of Hispanic Catholics and just 12% of Black Protestants now approve of Trump's handling of his job. And importantly, among the large and growing group of Americans who are religiously unaffiliated, these are people who describe themselves religiously as atheists or agnostics or as simply nothing in particular. Among that group, just 1 in 4 now say they approve of Trump's performance. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the magnitude of these declines. April was a bit of a high watermark in terms of the president's approval ratings. And these current readings aren't too different than what we saw earlier this year or even in the earliest days of the Trump administration. Still, I do think that these trends are noteworthy. And here's what we see when we look at the current state of the presidential race. Overall, Joe Biden has a 10-point lead. Biden performs best among Black Protestant voters, with nearly 9 in 10 saying that they would vote for him or that they would lean toward voting for him if the election were held today. 3/4 of religiously unaffiliated voters also say they would back Biden if the election were today, as do 52% of Catholics who prefer Biden to Trump. Though you can also see here that Trump is currently the preferred candidate of 57% of white Catholics. Most white Protestants, including more than 8 in 10 white evangelicals, say they support Trump. Now, if we take a step back, and this is important, I think, if we take a step back and we take a look at the long-term trends in American religion, we can see a variety of developments underway that, all else equal, could bode well for the Democratic Party in the years ahead. All 3 of the white Christian groups in which majorities say they plan to vote for Trump, all 3 of those groups are declining as a share of the population. White evangelical Protestants now make up 16% of the population, down from 19% a decade ago. White Protestants who are not evangelical have seen their population share decline by 4 points over that same period, as have white Catholics. Their share of the population is down 4 points over the last decade. Those 3 groups, white evangelicals, white non-evangelical Protestants, and white Catholics, those 3 groups together made up 51% of the population a decade ago. Today, those 3 groups combined make up just 39% of the US population. By comparison, you can see here the size of the Black Protestant and Hispanic Catholic populations is relatively stable, and religiously unaffiliated people, that strongly Democratic group, that group is growing very rapidly. But while the growing ranks of the religiously unaffiliated make them an increasingly important political constituency, it's worth remembering that it's still the case that most voters in the United States are indeed religious people. You can see that here. You can see even in the Democratic Party, where the religiously unaffiliated have grown more rapidly than in the Republican Party, fully half of Democrats are Christians, and an additional 9% identify with other faiths like Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, Hinduism, and many others. Fully 1/4 of Democrats are Christians from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds, including 8% who are Catholics from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds. And with that in mind, when I look ahead to this year's election, I will be keeping an eye on the extent to which the Democratic Party is able to appeal to religious voters. Can they appeal both to some religious voters who have traditionally voted Republican and also to the deeply religious voters who have long been part of the Democratic coalition, especially those from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds? And can they do so? Can the Democratic Party do so while also consolidating and mobilizing support among non-religious voters that constitute a growing share of the Democratic base? Those are a few of the key questions at the intersection of religion and race and politics that I'll be watching as we approach Election Day. I hope some of that is helpful, and I'm looking forward to the discussion today.
Thank you very much, Greg. As usual, factual, analytical, and helpful. My experience is lots of us have opinions on the intersection of faith and politics. Very few people have real data, and you have data. Given that context, I want to ask the entire panel a very general question. What do you think the most important thing that is happening in the 2000 campaign at the intersection of faith and politics in light of these monumental challenges we face, the coronavirus pandemic, the economic collapse, and the national crisis around racial justice? What is the most important thing? What are you watching? And I'll begin with Mike Gerson.
Sure. Well, I wouldn't claim this is the most important, but it's certainly one of the most important, is that white evangelicals are beginning to come to terms with the choice they made in 2016, the relationship that they entered into with Donald Trump. They were a group losing social status. They adopted a narrative of fear, a belief that modernity had turned against them, that their institutions were going to be hounded, that they were going to be persecuted. And Donald Trump played into that. And this was really a very traditional, typical political deal made by many white evangelicals, which was, you protect us and we'll support you. And so they essentially bought into the notion of having a strong man protect the religious interests. And that, and Trump to some extent has played that role. But I guess what they're finding, they're being sobered, I would hope, by a few things. One of them, the first one just that needs to be said, is that type of agreement or deal has nothing actually to do with the social priorities of the Christian gospel. So they're acting like every other interest group in Washington may react. But that isn't particularly good enough for the Christian church, which is supposed to be motivated by something else, a transcendent view of human rights and dignity at its core. So I think that they're finding, secondly, I think that they're finding that association with Trump has huge social cost. And it's because the president has made xenophobia, racism, misogyny central to his message. And so they entered into this agreement to get something practical with Trump, but now are, I think, seen as cultural carriers of his message. And I think that's going to have long-term problems. And then I would just say, third, that one of the answers that were given by a lot of white evangelicals on why they supported Trump, against their own values. The answer that they often gave was, but Gorsuch. This idea that Supreme Court justices were worth any compromise, any agreement. They were worth this deal with the devil. But they are finding, of course, which others have found, that Supreme Court outcomes are not guaranteed. That in fact, this agreement to get judges in exchange for their soul has not always worked out the way that they want it to when it comes to the way that Supreme Court justices vote on key issues. So I think that there's significant sobering going on. And the question is, do they double down or they start to exhibit some different behavior?
Janae, Mike worked in the White House and is an evangelical. You're a young Catholic, part of the Mother Church of Catholic African Americans. You're also running for office. What do you think the most significant development is in this election in light of faith in public life?
As Mike said, it's hard to identify one thing as the most important because our lives are multi-issued, our issues intersect. And obviously 2020 has been an extremely difficult year because it exposed all of the weak points in our institutions and systems throughout the country, at the local level, at the federal level, and really globally. Our healthcare system, our emergency response systems, the economic stability of the majority of the people in the country has been threatened and really upended. And even our cultural narratives are shifting because we're saying the people that we've venerated as heroes for centuries, their stories are more complex than we've chosen to acknowledge. So these layers of crisis have made it impossible to ignore what's wrong with the systems that are supposed to provide structure to our society. So what we see is a group of people, our brothers and sisters in the nation, crying out and saying that these systems are not working for me. And the challenge and the opportunity is that people have been saying this for decades and really since the founding of our country. We've always wrestled with, do our systems work for us? But now more and more of us are seeing it so much more clearly because it's affecting us more acutely. So in a moment like this, it's very easy for us to revert into fear. When a moment like this, when so much is being brought to light, we could move farther into a place of fear, but we also have the opportunity to act with courage and faith. And so especially for people of faith, for people who identify as religious people or people of faith, this requires a level of discernment and a deep seeking of what is true. This political and social moment gives us the opportunity to be vulnerable about our own experiences, but also to be deeply present to the experiences of our brothers and sisters, including people with whom we couldn't identify or didn't identify 6 months ago or a year ago. So when I think about the most important focal point in this time, it's not only for lay people or for sort of the average citizen, it's also for politicians and other candidates like myself. We're called to respond to the crisis of this moment and find ways to meet the urgent needs, but also to move forward with faith and not fear. So how can we create alternatives or improve our systems so that the next time there's a crisis, we won't be in the same boat? So I think the important opportunity for us right now is not to preserve broken systems that clearly don't serve us well. We all see this with much greater clarity than we could have last year. If everything was working, we wouldn't be experiencing the collective suffering that we have right now. And so now is the time to shift those systems and to improve those systems so that they actually work better for all of us.
Thank you, Janae. Faith, not fear. That's a tremendous mandate. I would remind folks that if you have a question, send it in on the email that's on the screen and join us on social media as well. Justin, you're organizing with the AND campaign across the country. What does faith, not fear look like in 2020?
Yeah, well, I think it's about kind of leaning on your faith and not kind of resorting. I think Janae made some excellent points, not resorting to some of the fear tactics that we see so often. Those tactics can be easy, but I think they become destructive very quickly. The COVID-19 crisis, though, John, I think, and the racialized violence that we witnessed during the crisis have really laid bare many of the injustices and the racial disparities that are plaguing American society. We've seen the senseless police violence, the rates of Black people dying from the virus. That's been heartbreaking, and it's been a clear result of the disparities. And so I think, John, one of the things this moment has done is it has really exposed the issues in such a way that we couldn't avoid it. We had to acknowledge it, and we had to deal more deeply with these issues. And I think out of all the bad things that have happened, that's somewhat of a good thing. The fact that we had to address these issues also exposed really the insufficiency of the standard conservative and the standard progressive positions. The political right's anemic position on racial issues I think has become obvious and embarrassing to a lot of Republicans and hopefully to a lot of evangelicals. And that should have been the case a long time ago. So it's good to see folks like Senator Marco Rubio speaking up on those conversations. But the way Republicans have allowed President Trump to destructively manipulate race issues has just been shameful. And I think they'll be dealing with the loss of integrity and credibility for some time. On the other side, though, I think the irreverence and really the leadership aversion that's been cultivated on the left has become a major thorn in the side of many Democratic mayors and local leaders who actually have to govern. It's made it very difficult to govern. I mean, as many of them have tried to be strong but sensible on racial injustice, they've had to entertain all kinds of performative destruction, empty defiance, these sovereign zones and things of that nature before really even having an opportunity to address the issues at hand. And I'm hoping, part of what I'm seeing is that some people of faith seem to be more aware of the insufficiencies of these ideological tribes. And John, they're beginning to see the need for leadership outside of the generic conservative and generic progressive molds. So for me, what's been significant is that several of the important dynamics have been exposed. And now we have the opportunity to address them compassionately and thoughtfully. And I'm hoping that we do that.
Thank you much. Gabby, you're a White House reporter for Politico. You've been following Trump longer than most people. I think you were there when he took that ride down the escalator. You worked for the Washington Examiner, the New York Post. You've been on Fox News. You come from California. You're now, frankly, becoming one of the most thoughtful and important journalists at the intersection of religion and politics. You wrote a story just a few weeks ago about, the headline was, Trump allies see a mounting threat, Biden's rising evangelical support, which caused a stir. What do you think is going on? What does your reporting, your analysis tell you about what's going on with religion and politics?
Well, in the interest of fair journalism, I'd like to just point out two developments that I've been watching, one on the political right and one on the political left. And Michael sort of hit on this earlier, but one thing that we saw in Greg's presentation is that there has been a gradual erosion in President Trump's support among white evangelicals over the last 6 months. Beginning around the time that the coronavirus pandemic hit the United States, and only growing worse as we dealt with the pandemic, with the economic fallout, and then moved into this period of time where we have had now a very serious national conversation about racial injustice, racial reconciliation. And one thing that this has really accelerated is the breakdown of what's colloquially known as the religious right. So for decades, you had conservative Catholics, Protestants, Jews who opposed progressivism and threats to religious freedom, and had staked out sort of these clearly defined positions on your hot button issues like abortion, family, marriage. They all sort of fit under that umbrella of the religious right. And now, because of their affiliation with Trump, the fact the religious right has now almost become synonymous with white evangelicals who are supportive of President Trump, you have a lot of conservative Catholics, a lot of conservative Jews, Protestants, who are reluctant to identify as part of the religious right. They no longer want to be under that umbrella because they have been so turned off by the way that this president has conducted himself, the nature of his character, some of his policies, some of his rhetoric. And so you've had sort of this gradual breakdown in a political institution, movement, if you will, that for years dominated Republican politics. And so on the right, it's tough to see how that's going to actually play out in the 2020 cycle. But I do think that it's largely contributing to a lot of the erosion we've seen in the president's support among white Catholics and white evangelical Protestants. And it's become even more dramatic, just as I was saying, over the course of the coronavirus pandemic and the civil unrest that we've seen in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. These twin crises are far more tangible than anything that we've seen during the Trump administration previously. The pandemic has disrupted everybody's lives. A lot of people in this country are reevaluating the way that they think about racism and racial injustice. And I think that you're starting to see that have an impact on the relationship between white evangelicals and white Catholics and the Trump administration and President Trump. So that'll be something that I'm paying attention to, certainly, heading into the 2020 election. And then just quickly on the left, I also think, and Justin kind of got at this as well, back in 2008, when President Obama was campaigning for office, there was sort of this faith left voting bloc. He went out to churches, he pursued evangelical voters in a way that has been largely absent from Democratic candidates and campaigns in the last decade. Pete Buttigieg's candidacy was a really good case study in sort of the way that progressives have now talked about rooting progressive social causes in the faith, in Christian ideals such as loving thy neighbor and caring for the least among us, as opposed to, rooting these progressive social causes in disdain for Trump or for Republicans. And so I do think that there's a question of who sort of wins out on that view, that approach, and what impact long-term does that have on Democratic Party politics and progressive social causes.
Thank you very much, Gabby. I want to pick up on your last point. I have a lot of my own questions, but we have a ton of questions coming in. I want to go, we had a whole dialogue about the Democrats' God problem and their inability to reach out in some ways to religious voters. Some of it has to do with extremism on abortion, perhaps. You have major Democratic figures saying that pro-life convictions are not welcome in the party if people want to act on them. Justin, tell your story of how you got involved in this and why you're trying to lift up the voices of believers who believe in all life, all dignity within both parties.
Sure. Well, part of the story. I was a delegate at the Democratic National Convention in 2012 and 2016 in Congressman John Lewis's district. In 2012, I just kind of ran as a generic Democrat. I didn't really rock the boat. But in 2016, I was a lot more vocal, John, about being a Democrat who was more centered or traditional when it came to social issues, just like many other African Americans in my community. And so I ran as what we call the Hamer Democrat, named after civil rights legend Fannie Lou Hamer. And during my delegate election speech, I talked about things like poverty. I talked about education, but also about pro-life issues and religious freedom. And I won overwhelmingly in that very progressive district. But because of my views on the last two subjects, the last two topics, some of the far left leaders tried to have me removed from the Georgia delegation. And similarly, I have a good friend named Dr. Jaha Howard, who is a dentist and ran for Georgia State Senate as a Democrat. And he was smeared by secular progressives because of his Christian beliefs. And I think it's a microcosm, really, of the illiberalism that we're seeing growing in the Democratic Party. They want the votes of Black and brown Christians, but want to silence our values, it seems. And someone has to answer the question for me that how is it that not one nationally known Black or brown Democrat is pro-life when many of their constituents are? That seems like a miscarriage of democracy. And so I think at a time when Trump is kind of the thing holding the party together, they're really playing with fire. And so my intent with the AND campaign is to bring up some of those voices that say, no, we are here. We care about social justice and we care about moral order, and just to make sure that those voices get heard.
Well, in the Catholic community, we're not as creative. We haven't come up with the AND campaign. We call it the consistent ethic of life. And we're still trying to explain it. Janae, I'd like to come to you. You're a friend of the initiative, a leader in our Salt and Light Dialogues. You work in philanthropy. You've been active in your parish. But the most impressive thing is you've stepped up. You're running for DC City Council. Obviously, Georgetown doesn't endorse candidates for office. But I'd like to know why, when so many are cynical about public life, you've decided to not only throw your hat in, but throw your heart and your life into trying to make things better. Why did you decide to run?
It was quite a long journey, but I mean, ultimately, the personal is not, the personal is the political. And most of my career, as I said, has been in social justice nonprofit work, including faith-based community organizing. So I have spent my adult life surrounded by people who are exercising their faith in the political sphere. So this concept is not new to me. Going to Catholic school, being a Catholic, it's always been taught to me that we have to engage. And especially in this moment of crisis, I see many lay people and others who don't identify religiously stepping up to engage in community service and to take care of one another. Myself, I've also volunteered by giving people rides or bringing people food, really meeting people's basic needs. But I also have seen people paying closer attention to our political process, and both of those are necessary. And so I go back to what I said at the beginning, which is about discernment. I really got to this place of deciding to run because I discerned it. I prayed about it. I talked to people who had done it before, and I felt compelled to make a difference. Because ultimately, doing all of the community service and even voting, showing up to vote every single election, only goes so far. And I was observing that we had a lot of elected officials in Washington, D.C. who talked about equity, who talked about social justice, but having grown up in this area, having lived in different parts of the city and worked in different parts of the city, the disparities were very clear to me, especially along race lines and class lines. And those two things intersect. And because of my experience living all over the country, working in nonprofit organizations, meeting leaders who were engaging politically, locally, and federally, I knew that there were other ways to strengthen our economy. There were other ways to develop our neighborhoods. There were other ways to educate our children that didn't require that large swaths of people were pushed out of the city. And so I was motivated not only by my faith, but also by the examples of people that I know to exercise this right and run for office and think about policies where everyone in the city can thrive. I do want to talk about engaging locally, though. I think running for office locally in the midst of this large federal conversation, and especially in our nation's capital, is it's a very complex thing. You know, Washington, D.C. is not a state. We received half of the federal stimulus money that states did because we're not a state, but our population is larger than several states. And so we started this fiscal year with a $300 million surplus, and now we have a deficit. And so lay people, as well as candidates, as well as elected officials, again, need to hold that tension of how do we respond to those immediate needs, including the grief that we're all experiencing because of this crisis, as well as making decisions that are going to set us up for success in the long term. And all of that requires a deep level of discernment, which includes prayer, but it really includes a deep seeking of truth.
We have lots of questions, and there are a couple patterns in them that I'm going to try and summarize. Greg, I would give you a heads up that several people are asking for more information about Latino voters, African-American voters, and other voters. We focused a lot on white evangelicals, Latino Catholics, and white Catholics. What else is happening in there? If you could come in after this. But there's a lot of questions about, you have a majority of white Catholics supporting President Trump. Why is that, given that his policies, some would say his character, are inconsistent with Catholic values? What is driving the support for President Trump among religious voters? And I'd invite anybody, maybe Justin and Mike. Mike talked a little bit about what's going on with evangelicals. Mike knows Catholic social teaching better than most Catholics. So maybe start with Justin and Mike on why are white religious voters still supporting President Trump in such insignificant but reduced numbers?
Yeah, John, I would say one of the things that I've been seeing is just, number one, kind of an addiction to power, just not being able to let go of kind of being in control, which, as you have mentioned, is far from being biblical. But then something else that comes to mind is also putting winning before the witness, and it's really short-term thinking. I think to get the short-term wins, and we know that the Supreme Court and those things matter. I mean, that it's not a small deal. But the AND campaign always says that our witness has to be more important than winning. What message are we sending? Because those two things often come in conflict. Look, I'm a political strategist. I never strategize to lose. But when in conflict, as Christians, we have to send the right message way before we think about having political power or winning. And then from an African-American perspective, I think there was always the thought that the conversation about character mattering and all those things was just pretext. And what has been proven through this time is that it was indeed pretext, and that sometimes principles change when you're in a situation where you want to win political capital.
Michael, in one of your recent columns, you said, for some of us, the ideal is more on the model of Christian social teaching, solidarity with the vulnerable, respect for institutions, care for creation, the embrace of refugees and immigrants, and support for government that seeks the common good. Neither political party currently measures up to this ideal, nor cares to. What do you think is going on in terms of the enduring support for Trump among white Christians, Catholics, evangelicals, and others?
I think the most disturbing aspect that I've seen is that a lot of white evangelicals don't support Trump in spite of his cruelty and bullying. They support Trump because of his cruelty and bullying. They've essentially hired someone to defend them, and they don't want someone who's going to play by necessarily even by Christian rules. And that when you look at Falwell, when you look at Jeffress and some of these other figures, when Donald Trump belittles or attacks or engages in cruel discourse, they're positively supportive. So this to me is the most disturbing aspect of all this. Is it's not in spite of, but a because of, and that's I find it deeply discrediting, because many evangelicals, white evangelicals, have adopted tactics that are fundamentally inconsistent with their view of human dignity, which is the way that others are treated, the causes you adopt. This is the central Christian contribution to our political dialogue over the hundreds of years of American history, is this view that human beings, that no insignificant person was ever born. And if you look at what white evangelicals are identified with now, they're identified with a man that they believe is effective in defending their interests using the standards of the world. And that's ultimately discrediting.
Janae, you and I are the two Catholics on this call. Do you have a comment?
Yes. So, I can't comment on why white evangelicals are doing what they're doing, because I'm not a white evangelical. But I do think that, again, going back to my comment around fear, I think that many, many people are in a place of fear. And when they perceive that they are winning, it helps alleviate some of that feeling of fear. But I think that we all have an obligation to look more critically at our elected officials and those of us like me who are seeking to be an elected official, and getting back to what's fundamental, especially as people of faith. So, for example, here in Washington, D.C., Mayor Bowser, who's an African-American woman, painted Black Lives Matter on 16th Street leading up to the White House. And nationally, people were very excited about that. Locally, people were excited about that. But when you look at her budget proposal, it didn't reflect that same sentiment. It didn't reflect aggressive and bold and courageous actions to help decrease disparities in Washington, D.C. So I think for every elected official, if there is a demonstration or a stunt or an action that's taking place, even if it makes us feel good in the moment, we all have a responsibility and an obligation to dig more deeply and figure out what's underneath that and what's fundamentally important.
Thank you. I would say, as somebody who works on this and watches this, that for a lot of the people I know, the pro-life issue, the question of the protection of unborn children is central to this. And two things have gone on. Whether you believe Trump is sincere or not, he has promised policies and promised judges that will uphold the lives of unborn children. And Democrats have gone the other way. Joe Biden began as a pro-life Democrat, supported the Hyde Amendment for 40 years, and they've communicated to us in lots of ways that those views are not respected in the party. And so I think we have to acknowledge that many people spend too much time focusing on abortion. I would not want our dialogue to neglect that issue. The protection of life, all life, the way that Justin and others have talked about it, is really important. One question we got, and let me halt that and go to Greg. People are really interested in what's going on with the Latino community, the African American community, and other religious voters. What can you tell us?
I would point to a couple of things. I think number one, when you think about politics in the United States, when you think about religion in politics, we have to remember that you simply cannot avoid, you cannot overlook the importance of race as a factor in understanding the way Americans approach politics. And when we look at people from racial and ethnic minority backgrounds, especially Hispanics, especially Black people, we see that on average, those groups tend to be very deeply religious and strongly democratic in the way they approach politics. Those two things go together in many racial and ethnic minority communities in the United States. When we think about the God gap in American politics, the religious divide in American politics, that's something that really only exists among white people. It's true that deeply religious white people tend to be much more Republican, much more politically conservative than white people who are not particularly religious. That's a huge divide within the white community. When we look at racial and ethnic communities in the United States, that God gap simply doesn't exist. Most of them are both deeply religious and strongly democratic. I would also point to one other factor in understanding the way white Catholics in particular, but other white Christian groups approach politics. We think of these as religious groups, and that's important. But I also think part of what we see happening is the power of partisanship to shape people's politics. It doesn't simply reflect their political position, their policy preferences. It can shape their policy preferences. So when we look at Catholics, for example, who think of themselves as Republicans, they don't like Donald Trump in spite of his policies. They like Donald Trump because of his policies. They tell us they want to see the wall on the southern border expanded. They tell us they don't think climate change is a real problem. So we see that they've adopted the positions of their preferred party more so than they reflect the positions of the Catholic Church. The same thing is true on the flip side, I would say. When we look at Catholic Democrats, there are many of them who are pro-life, but most of them are not. Most of them go against the church's position when it comes to their own personal views about whether or not abortion should be legal. So just a couple things to keep in mind.
Yeah. Gabby, you cover these issues every day. What is your sense of how the two parties, why do white Catholics, evangelicals stick? Why do African American and some white Catholics and evangelicals are slipping? How do you analyze the God gap, as it's been phrased, and the way the abortion issue works in our politics?
Well, Michael made a great point when he was talking earlier about how white evangelicals and some white Catholics in particular want somebody who will stand up for them, that they appreciate the fact that the president's rhetoric is sometimes unrefined and really antagonistic. And I've been to upwards of 75 Trump rallies at this point over the course of covering him for 5 years. And just in conversations with your religious Trump voter, the conservative Christians, the one thing that they say consistently is that they feel as though for the past half decade, there has been a growing hostility to men and women of faith in this country, regardless of which side of the aisle they fall on, that they will point to it in the Democratic Party, as Justin was sort of talking about earlier, where there has now been litmus tests imposed for candidate positions on issues like abortion. And then they will point to it in terms of religious freedom issues and feeling as though not only have conservative Christians lost on a lot of social issues in the last decade, but that there has been a growing hostility toward religion. And so that is the primary attraction to somebody like Donald Trump. If you look at the number of white evangelicals who supported President Trump, who voted for him in 2016, it was 81%. But if you break that down and you ask them, do you actually think that President Donald Trump is religious himself? Fewer than 40% will say that they agree with that statement. And so it's not as though they're looking for somebody who embodies the same characteristics that they do, the same values, the same ideals, the same behavior. They're looking for somebody who will simply be an attack dog, a defender, somebody who will stand up for that community, even if it's because it's politically expedient for him. At the very least, the fact that he is doing it is what keeps them coming back. And so just on the right, I think that's a really important way of looking at the relationship that exists, the alliance that has been built between President Donald Trump and his white evangelical supporters and white Catholic supporters.
Two-part question. Start with Gabby and then anyone else to weigh in. What is the role of religious leaders in this? We've had lots of comments and questions about the Catholic bishops seeming to get close to President Trump. We've had Trump retweeting a letter of endorsement from Archbishop Vigano, who called for the removal of Pope Francis. In your reporting, you talk about how both campaigns have opportunities and dangers in how they reach out to religious voters. And then after you share what you've been reporting on, I would ask the others, what is the role? What are the right things and the wrong things for bishops and other religious leaders to be doing in an incredibly momentous, consequential, polarized election? So start with Gabby. What you talked about the fear in the Trump campaign and the opportunity for the Biden campaign.
Yeah, I mean, for Biden, I think the opportunity is that he does have a way to peel off support right now from President Trump among evangelicals and Catholics. Just because of the sort of erosion that's happened so far, we know that they are trending away from President Trump. Doesn't mean that they are trending toward Biden, but there's at least an opportunity there to appeal to disaffected religious voters who previously supported the president. The challenge for Biden is, of course, the same challenge that Obama faced back in 2008 and back in 2012. The religious leaders that you choose to associate with as a candidate, the people who you put in charge of coalitions for your campaign, who you campaign alongside, whose churches you appear at, can become a controversy. I would say that Farrakhan is one of the greatest examples of that for Obama. It was a thorn in his side for many years within progressive circles. On the right with Trump, it's the same thing. The role of the religious leaders for him, including, not just clergy, but people who are identified among the religious right as devoutly Christian, icons within the religious right, people like Mike Pence, is to help reinvigorate and solidify that relationship with his base. But the risk that he runs, similar to Biden, is the people that he associates with. In this administration, you have people like Paula White, Jerry Falwell Jr., Robert Jeffress, whose church the vice president just visited in Texas. A lot of controversial evangelical figures who do repel some evangelicals who don't think that these are gospel preaching Christians. And the president has chosen to align himself with them in a way that threatens to drive away some of his religious supporters. And so I think the affiliation that the people that they're religious people that both candidates choose to surround themselves with is crucial. And it's why it's important for both campaigns to have truly religious advisors, people who know the church well, know their church communities well, and know, which type of faith actors are going to actually have the best interest of the candidate, but also be gospel preaching Christians.
Some of those people you mentioned aren't big fans of the Catholic Church either. There's some history there. To other members of the panel, what should religious leaders be doing and not doing? What are our bishops? What are other religious leaders? What is their temptations and what are their obligations? Anybody want to jump in on that?
I'll jump in on that.
Great, Janae.
So thinking specifically about Catholic faith leaders, bishops, and clergy, I think the last part of what Gabby said is critically important, and I don't want it to get lost, which is reflecting the experiences of their faith communities. So the bishops in particular have a unique challenge of speaking both to congregations and to lay people and helping with that discernment process that I've been talking about, as well as speaking to elected officials and candidates in an advisory capacity. And I think that needs to be deeply informed by the experiences of the people, especially in moments of deep crisis where we are right now. I think very practically that means being explicit about things like race and racism. And just alluding back to the earlier conversation, I think it's really important that when we talk about the intersection of race and religion, that we don't relegate it to people of color. So, Black folks, Latino folks, Latinx folks, and how that intersects with religion. But whiteness also plays a very strong role in how people integrate and interpret their religious beliefs. And so when folks are saying that they feel attacked because of their religious beliefs, but are not able to articulate how they feel about their whiteness, that's something that I think our religious leaders can help us do by naming what is very real and present, both historically and in the modern day in our society. So I think clergy have that opportunity to guide the discernment of lay people. They have that opportunity to reflect the experiences of lay people and incorporate that into religious guidance that they give to elected officials.
Thank you. Mike or Justin, any comment on what religious leaders should be doing and not doing?
Well, I briefly add, just from the other side, from the candidate side, that Joe Biden is a bit of a throwback because he actually cares what religious leaders think to some extent. He would want the bishops to be supportive. He was concerned in the context of Obamacare within the administration in making sure that he got the support of religious leaders, religious people. If you look at that field and Beto O'Rourke or even Pete Buttigieg to some extent, I think that they're even as concerned about what religious leaders have to say on a variety of issues. Biden also has the advantage of speaking about faith from a personal perspective in a way that hasn't been true of recent Democratic candidates, and particularly in the context of grief and loss and the comfort of faith when it comes to the terrible losses that he's engaged in his life. So in a certain way, I do think that there's an opportunity out there. It's not going to impress Robert Jeffress, but there's an opportunity, if he wanted to, for Joe Biden to make an appeal to a broadly religious audience and to do so in a way that just shows the authenticity of his faith.
Sort of pulling this together, I recall a line in the Faithful Citizenship document. They're called to be political but not partisan, to be engaged but not used. And I think we have to go back to Janae's point. bishops, other religious leaders have to be clear, explicit, and focused on racism. That's a test for them. It's a test for us. It's a particular test for white leaders and white Christians. We're getting a number of questions about where do people find a home? Where can young people, where can religious leaders, where can believers find a home in a political environment that makes that really difficult? How do you hold fast to your beliefs when you don't fit perfectly in any party? Obviously, the AND campaign is an example of that. What are the other ways in which people who share a consistent commitment to human life and dignity, to oppose racism, to care for creation, how do we make our voices heard? Where do we find strength?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think part of it starts with, because finding institutions is important. So I do think we have to act through institutions. But I think even before that step is making sure we just disentangle ourselves from our identity, rather, from partisanship and from ideological tribes. Look, it's fine to be a Democrat. It's fine to be a Republican, but that should not be part of your identity. And I think the reason why that's important is because our political landscape seems to kind of separate social justice and moral order. And that's why I think a lot of Christians especially are kind of upset, because you see this separation, especially in this moment. You see that separation between social justice and moral order as if they're mutually exclusive. So if you're on the left, then you care about social justice. If you're on the right, that you care about moral order. But unless you disentangle your identity from partisanship and ideological tribes, you miss the fact that Christians, at least, are supposed to be about both. So we need to dismantle that false dichotomy, because people of faith have to be willing to attack racial justice while promoting a strong family ethic and the sanctity of life. But when you get too caught up in the partisanship, then there's not really an opportunity to do that. And so I think finding institutions that allow you to kind of cultivate that and encourage you and embolden you to do those things is very important, because at this moment, people of faith need to be able to step back and critique in a very serious way their party or their ideological tribe. And if you're too caught up in it, you're not going to be able to do that. And I would just end by saying one of the things that my good friend Michael Ware always says is that parties were never supposed to be our home in the first place. So the fact that you don't feel comfortable in a political party doesn't mean you shouldn't participate, but that's actually a good thing, because you shouldn't be feeling comfortable. You should be challenging them, because there's plenty to challenge on both sides.
Well, let me turn to Gabby and go back to the beginning in a way. In your reporting, you've been to all those rallies. You've been looking at these issues since you started in journalism only a few years ago, but you've already blazed the trail. What are you looking for as this campaign plays out? What are the surprises that you've seen so far, and what do you think are the developments that we ought to be watching for?
Well, I think for most of the Trump presidency up until earlier this year, it was hard to envision anything that would turn off white evangelicals, turn them away from his base, turn them away from the administration. And the moment that we're in, with conversations happening about race that have never before taken place in the public sphere like they are now, where churches are talking about them, where even the staunchest Trump-supporting white evangelical is confronted with questions within their church community that they now have to reflect on and answer to. And then, of course, simultaneously a global pandemic happening that is restricting people from holding funerals for family members and, administering to their church communities and gathering together in person for worship. It has really created an environment where you are slowly starting to see conservative Christians, primarily white evangelicals and white Catholics, trend away from the president. And that's what I'm going to be paying attention to at least until November, to see if that continues, if it reverses itself, and if it does reverse, what caused it. The second thing I would say is the Supreme Court. I mean, this Supreme Court season, the decisions that we've seen in the last 3 weeks have created a whole bunch of theories about the impact that this is going to have on conservative Christians and the sort of the religious right that I was talking about and how they respond in 2020. Are they so disaffected that they just don't turn out? And does that harm the president's reelection campaign beyond repair? Or do they double down? Are they so fired up by the fact that Justice Gorsuch, somebody who they put their stock in, somebody who they ushered through the entire confirmation process, let them down essentially? Do they think that they need to get more Supreme Court justices and more conservative judges throughout our judicial system in order to finally get what they would consider wins on social issues? So those are the two questions that I unfortunately don't have answers to, but they're the trends that I'm definitely paying attention to before the election.
Well, if you're not reading Gabby in Politico, you should, because she will follow those questions. Janae, let me ask you, what are you looking for? And in particular, what would you say to young people about political life, their obligations and their opportunities?
Yeah, I think, when I was in school as a very young person, I was always told we should vote, we should vote, we should vote. And even in my high school civics class, which many high schools don't have anymore, the details of the process weren't really exposed to me. And so we have so much power as citizens in this country to engage. If you volunteer for a candidate, even if you're not entirely sure about them, to make calls for them, you're getting the opportunity to talk to other voters, hear what people think, hear what is important to them, expand your own horizons. If you donate, if you sign to get a candidate on a ballot, you're engaging in every step of the way to think about how a person who represents your point of view can have a shot in an election. And of course, voting is important. But even if you feel that you can't do any of that right now, I think it's important for us to educate ourselves differently. Go beyond the headlines, go beyond the tweet, go beyond sort of the one-liners, or even the journalists or folks that we've come to rely on, and stretch ourselves to get a deeper understanding of what's happening, and also a deeper understanding of how the decisions we make impact other folks. I appreciated what Justin said about this false dichotomy between moral issues and social justice. And I think it requires a deeper level of analysis. We all should be challenging ourselves to have a more sophisticated analysis of what it means that life is sacred, from conception to death. What does it mean to say that people have a fair opportunity to work hard and gain economic stability for themselves and for their families, and how all of these issues intersect? They're not individualized, they're not isolated, and we have the ability now, we have more information than we've ever had before to educate ourselves and go farther to have a deeper level of analysis.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Michael, what are you looking for between now and November? You've been through presidential elections. You served in the White House. You've made a difference for people in this country, low-income people in this country and around the world. What are you looking for over the next 5 months?
Well, I'm really looking particularly in the Christian community. When I talk to Christian groups, white evangelical groups, what I often end up asking is, what are you known for right now in American politics? And I think that Christians in many ways are known for the defense of their own institutions and their own views, rather than being known as the defenders of human rights and dignity. So I think that it's going to have to be a lot of hard thinking. And it's become possible in this environment because of issues like race, also issues like the protection of senior citizens when it comes to health issues, that we need Christians to have that contribution in our common life. It's a gap, it's a need that I think that Christians need to fill in a principled way. And so I hope that that's what happened. I mean, I saw in my own life that conservatives and liberals, secular and religious, came together on issues like PEPFAR or the President's Malaria Initiative to save millions of lives of non-citizens, and to provide real hope and change in places around the world. And so I think it's still possible in our common life to have safe havens or protected places that are no longer under the demands of polarization, that we can really set off some issues and say, these are matters of conscience that can be broadly shared. And I think issues can play that role.
Thank you very much. I'm going to bring our conversation to an end. I want to thank the audience. There will be resources on our webpage. You can find out more about the End campaign. You can see some of what Gabby's written and what Janae and Mike have been working on. I want to thank our partners at the Berkeley Center, Optimum Audio, and AI Media. I especially want to thank my colleagues, Kim Daniels and Anna Misla, who make this happen. I want to thank especially our panel, who have offered insight, but also passion and conviction. I said at the beginning that this was a test for us, and in some ways, this comes back to fundamentals. I think what we're going through now, this pandemic, this economic collapse, this racial crisis, this election is a test of faith, it's a test of hope, and it's a test of love. What do we believe? What are we going to become? And are we going to demonstrate our love for all God's children? We're in the middle of an enormous test of who we are and what we believe. And I want to thank our 5 panelists, Greg, who has given us such a wonderful briefing on what's going on. I want to thank them for their insight, but also for their example. Thank you for joining us.